You've heard of Mother Teresa before, but do you know her real story? You might know how she created a worldwide charitable organization, or how she received the Nobel Peace Prize, or how she was a beacon of light for millions of people across the world. But did you also know that she had many controversies during her life, and how she also went through years of spiritual darkness? And so in this video, I'm going to walk you through her story, why she became a saint, and what we can learn from her life. She was born in 1910 in a city under Ottoman control, known for its mix of wealthy homes beside poor neighborhoods. Her father was a successful businessman who often invited the archbishop and the poor alike to his house. Her mother, Drona, was a devout Catholic. The household was known for their faith, daily Bible readings, and prayer. From an early age, Teresa went to church services and often sang in the choir, and she was singled out for solo parts. But when Teresa was 8, her father died suddenly, likely from poisoning from political rivals. Regardless of what happened, the family quickly fell into poverty. Drona, who was now the sole breadwinner, took on sewing to help support her children. Despite their poverty, Teresa's mother would often invite a woman who had been abandoned by her family to feed her and clean her house. This compassion rubbed off on Teresa, and when she was 9, she gave her only coin to a beggar. Teresa's childhood and early teenage years were like most kids. She harbored thoughts of being a writer, a musician, and she had even gotten 2 articles published in the newspaper. But she had this thought that whatever she would do, she would dedicate her life to God. So, when she was 12 and made a pilgrimage to the shrine of the Black Madonna, statue of the Virgin Mary, she felt a spiritual awakening, and she suddenly felt that she wanted to serve others, especially the poor. But if she did decide to become a nun, it would come at a great sacrifice because Teresa wanted children. But that decision took Teresa 6 years of praying, talking, and having counsel with the priests and elders of her community. But at the age of 18, she decided to join the Covenant of Nuns. But her mother initially said no, and she even locked herself in her room for 24 hours to test if Teresa's calling was for real or not. Because if she did join the convent, not only would she not be able to have children, but she also probably wouldn't see her family ever again. This is the early 1900s. Planes didn't even exist. Boats were expensive. Traveling was a lot. But when she left her room, she gave her blessing to Teresa on one condition: you must live only for God. Upon arriving in India, Teresa was immediately struck by the incredible poverty she saw here. Open sewers ran alongside streets where families hid under torn cloth for shelter. Sister Teresa began teaching at St. Mary's School in Calcutta, where she was kind of isolated from the extreme poverty of the area because only students who could afford to go to school were taught by her. But even then, she still saw students who experienced poverty. Students who would walk dozens of miles to school, sometimes walking as much as 3 hours. She even said, one man arrived with a bundle from which protruded what the young novice at first thought to be 2 dried twigs, but which proved to be the emaciated legs of a boy so weak he was on the point of death. And it's not like at this time Mother Teresa had millions of dollars to give to her students, because even she wore tattered clothes and her feet were totally busted up because she wore the same sandals that the locals were. But despite the poverty she experienced and the locals experienced, Teresa was struck by how even in these horrible conditions, the locals found so many reasons to be happy. She wrote after one visit to a woman who possessed so desperately little, but who greeted her arrival with an overwhelming display of happiness. But even these small glimpses of happiness would be tested by the Bengal famine. She saw an explosion in the number of war babies left on doorsteps, and how she woke up one day to find 24 babies that she needed to feed. But regardless, Teresa was determined that her teaching would not be interrupted, and while some of her fellow co-workers left, she stayed, helping her students and the people who needed it most. But after this, she was tired, exhausted, on her last legs, and so she left on a spiritual retreat. It was then she saw a series of progressively intensifying scenes of extreme poverty and disaster, followed by a wave of darkness. She heard Jesus speaking to her, telling her to leave the convent, leave the nuns, leave the school, leave the safety she had before, and help serve the poorest of the poor. But when she approached her superiors about this calling, she was actually rejected at first by the archbishop because it kind of painted a picture at that time. Teresa wanted to go into the slums as a single woman going into a place that she would be treated horribly, she'd be threatened with her life. It just wasn't going to be safe for Mother Teresa. But Teresa was not deterred by these arguments, and she continually asked for permission, asked again and again and again, and 2 years later, she got her yes. In 1948, Sister Teresa left the convent armed with only her faith, 5 rupees, and the blue and white sari, which you all know and love her for, which should help her blend in with the poorest of the poor. Again, she experienced absolute poverty, children sleeping in gutters, human waste filling the air, but yet Mother Teresa walked these same streets, searching for someone to help. And it was here that she actually started a school, but rather than having a chalkboard, she drew shapes in the dirt. Nevertheless, 21 people showed up on the first day, and on the next day, that doubled, growing exponentially, because the poorest of the poor there were hungry for someone, anybody, to care about them that they probably would have never experienced if it wasn't for Mother Teresa. But despite her honorable mission, she also felt deep loneliness, where she went years without ever feeling the presence of God. On one particular night, where she was horribly burnt out, walking through the streets, aches on her feet, her back breaking, that she wrote about how going back to the religious order seemed really good, and yet she stayed. But as Mother Teresa kept the faith, kept on going, she even inspired a girl whose name is
Subhasini Das,
who had been entrusted to Mother Teresa's protection after her parents wanted her to have a forced marriage. And this was the spark that Mother Teresa needed to start the beginnings of her greater order. 10 girls arrived, all former pupils of Teresa's. One by one, they began the work of serving the poorest of the poor. But sometimes they faced rejection and abuse. One girl's family was embarrassed by her involvement with Mother Teresa's order. One father told his daughter that she was dead to him. And yet, they carried on, crossing railroad lines, jumping over ditches, and wading through pools of disgusting water. On these walks, they would often recite prayers to help distract them from everything that was happening. But one time, the stench of the waters of human waste was so strong that even the rosary couldn't distract them from it, and they had to sing the High Mass in Latin. Mother Teresa worked harder than anyone else and bared the brunt of most of these sufferings. She would be the last one to go to sleep, and yet she was the first one to wake up and go into the chapel and pray. And yet she always did this with absolute joy, because she trusted in God completely and entirely. One time, the small community had no food. The students were worried. How are we going to feed the people? How are we going to feed ourselves? What's going to happen? And just a couple minutes later, there was a knock on the door. A woman appeared, completely unknown to the people there, showing up with bags of rice. She explained that she felt this sudden desire to go there, but she had no reason for this. This was a sign of the growing power of the order and would lead Archbishop to later change his mind about what had happened and say that this is the work of God. And just like that, Mother Teresa has succeeded. She'd succeeded in creating an order to serve the poorest of the poor. Now I can talk about how Mother Teresa turned a Hindu temple into a hospice for the poor. I can talk about how the locals threatened Mother Teresa with death, and she replied, "If you kill us, we would only hope to reach God sooner." I can talk about how she established a leper colony, which restored respect to the lepers, giving them a place to work, live, and get the love of God. I can talk about how the Pope gifted her a limousine in recognition of her efforts, but she sold the limousine to donate to the poor. I can talk about how the Nobel Peace Prize dinner that she was rewarded, she instead took this and gave it to the poor. I can talk about how at her funeral, India rewarded her with the highest honor anybody could receive. And how while Princess Diana, Hillary Clinton, and other famous people were there, the most powerful thing were the tens of thousands of the poor that were there supporting her, seeing her as a beacon of light and hope. But at the root of it all, I just want to explain that Mother Teresa was a great person. She loved humanity and lived like Christ, where he said, "How you treat the poorest of the poor is how you will be rewarded in heaven." Because the truth is that Mother Teresa couldn't solve all the suffering in the world, No matter how hard she tried, no matter how many 100-hour work weeks, 120-hour work weeks, pouring her soul into her work, nothing she could do could solve it. It was impossible for one woman to do, but she tried. God bless you, Mother Teresa. May you rest in peace. And that's about it for this one. Here's another video you can check out. All right, bye. Have a nice day. See ya. Bye-bye.